It had been 3 days since the dog first appeared by the grave. The town of Hollingsworth, a sleepy little place nestled between misty hills and dense woods, had seen its share of odd occurrences, but nothing like this. The cemetery at the edge of town, usually a place of quiet reflection for the elderly and a final resting place for the forgotten, now had a dark, eerie presence that no one could shake. The graveyard was old, its stones cracked and weathered. By years of wind and rain, many names now barely legible lost to time. It was a peaceful place in the daylight, but once nightfall came, a quiet tension seemed to settle over the place. The locals would whisper, saying that you could almost hear the voices of the past if you listened closely, but they never expected that something, or someone, would actually manifest from those whispers. For the first time in decades, something was different. The dog had appeared out of nowhere, a small golden retriever, thin and ragged, its fur matted with the dirt and rain of the past few days. The dog had not barked, had not shown any signs of aggression or fear. It simply sat there facing a particular grave, staring at the earth as if waiting for something, or someone. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, as if it were transfixed, caught in an invisible force. At first, people thought it was just another stray. The dog had wandered in, perhaps chasing a scent, looking for food. But the longer it stayed, the more unsettling it became. It didn't leave the grave. Not for food. Not for water. It simply remained there, sitting in the cold. Its loyalty, unwavering. Every day, people who passed by the cemetery noticed the dog in the same spot. Some tried to call it to lure it away with food, but the dog did not budge. The old man who lived on the corner, Mr. Finch, claimed he had seen the dog for hours at a time, never moving, only watching the grave with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "I've lived here all my life," Mr. Finch told a neighbor one evening, his voice low and anxious. "And I've never seen anything like it. That dog, it's not normal. There's something wrong about it. I don't like it." The neighbor, a young woman named Alice, had laughed at first, thinking the old man was just being superstitious. "Oh, come on, Mr. Finch. It's just a dog. Maybe it's lost or sick, but it's not like it's a ghost." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The dog's eyes, those deep, sorrowful eyes, lingered in her mind long after the conversation ended. There was something about the way the dog looked at the grave. It was more than just loyalty. There was a sense of waiting for something or someone. Alice couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, as she walked home from the bakery, she took the long way through the cemetery, hoping to get a glimpse of the strange animal. Sure enough, as she entered the cemetery, she saw it, sitting in the same spot, its gaze locked on the grave in front of it. She hesitated for a moment, then approached. "Hey there, boy," she called gently, crouching down a few feet away from the dog. "You lost?" The dog didn't flinch. Its tail didn't wag. It didn't even acknowledge her presence. It simply stared straight ahead, as if Alice wasn't even there. Her voice trailed off, the air around them growing colder. Alice looked at the grave the dog was guarding. It was one of the older ones in the cemetery with a faded marble headstone that was barely legible. She took a few steps closer to it, her curiosity getting the better of her. The name was worn, but just visible enough to make out Sarah Harland. The date of birth and death were both illegible, but the date of death, partially visible, seemed to have been many years ago. "That's strange," Alice muttered to herself. "I've lived here for years, and I've never heard of anyone named Sarah Harland." The dog shifted slightly, its gaze following Alice's every movement, but it still did not move. There was an odd heaviness in the air now, and Alice felt an inexplicable chill run through her spine. It wasn't just the cold autumn air, it was something else. The presence of the dog, the way it refused to leave, was unnatural. She took a few steps back. "Okay, I'll leave you be," she murmured, unsure whether she was speaking to the dog or the grave itself. Something about the scene unsettled her, but before she could turn around, she heard a soft rustling noise behind her. Alice froze. She spun around expecting to see someone else, but there was only the dog staring at her, its eyes wide and full of an emotion she couldn't place. Then, almost imperceptibly, the dog let out a low, mournful whine. It wasn't loud, but it carried a deep sadness that made Alice's chest tighten. Without thinking, she quickly turned and left the cemetery, the sound of the dog's whine echoing in her ears. It stayed in her mind long after she had crossed the town's main road and was back home. The dog, the grave, the strange sadness that hung in the air like a shroud, none of it made sense. The next morning, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to tell her friend, Karen, about the dog in the grave. But when Alice arrived at the cemetery that afternoon, the dog was still there. And this time, more people had gathered. A small crowd had gathered along the fence, watching the dog from a distance. Whispers floated through the air, their voices full of curiosity and unease. "I heard the dog's been there for days now," one man said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Doesn't even move to eat or drink, just sits there." Another woman, clutching a purse tightly, added, "Maybe it's waiting for something, maybe it's guarding something." But as Alice looked closer, her eyes caught something even stranger. The dog wasn't just staring at the grave now, it was watching them, its gaze shifting slowly as if it was aware of their presence, calculating. Alice felt a jolt of discomfort in her stomach. The dog's eyes weren't like any eyes she had ever seen before. They were full of grief, of longing, of something darker. Before she could think further, a police car pulled up at the entrance to the cemetery. The officers who emerged from the vehicle exchanged glances, their faces tight with unease. The atmosphere in Hollingsworth had grown heavy, as though a storm was coming, even though the sky remained clear. News of the dog's strange vigil by the grave spread like wildfire through the town. People gathered in groups, whispering about the dog's unrelenting presence and the unsettling aura it seemed to cast over the cemetery. No one was quite sure what to make of it, but everyone felt a sense of unease in the pit of their stomachs. Detective Jacobs had been the first to arrive, summoned by concerned townsfolk who feared the dog might be sick, or worse, might have gone rabid. He had watched from a distance, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with the practiced patience of someone used to dealing with bizarre and inexplicable cases. The dog's unblinking stare, the grave it guarded so fiercely, it didn't sit right with him. "It's strange," Jacobs murmured to his partner, Officer Thompson, who had joined him. "There's something off about it. The way it just sits there like it's waiting." Thompson nodded, her brow furrowed. "And why this grave? No one's come to visit for years. It's like it's waiting for someone or something." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, observing the dog. Its golden coat, once vibrant, was now a muted yellow, dirty and matted. Yet, its eyes, those haunting eyes, seemed to hold an unspoken story. Jacobs glanced over at the old gatekeeper's house, a small, weather-beaten cottage just inside the cemetery's boundary. He knew the man who lived there, Tom Winters. Tom had been the cemetery's caretaker for over 2 decades, maintaining the grounds, tending to the graves, and ensuring the peace of the place. "Let's talk to Tom," Jacobs said, breaking the silence. "He might know something about this." The two officers walked down the gravel path toward the caretaker's cottage. It was an isolated little building, surrounded by overgrown ivy and brambles, and the smell of old pine and moss lingered in the air. They knocked on the door, and after a few moments it creaked open, revealing the grizzled face of Tom Winters. His eyes were bleary with age, but sharp nonetheless. He was a man used to solitude, and his demeanor reflected it. "Detective Jacobs, Officer Thompson," Tom greeted them with a nod. "I know why you're here. It's about the dog, isn't it?" Jacobs was taken aback by how quickly Tom had read them. "You already know?" Tom leaned against the doorframe, rubbing his thick beard as he stared out at the cemetery. "I've seen the dog. Been sitting there for days, guarding that grave. I've lived here for long enough to know when something isn't right, and that's not right." The officers exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Thompson asked. Tom hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to reveal something he had kept quiet about for years. Finally, he sighed and motioned for them to come inside. It's a long story, he said, his voice low and gravelly. But I'll tell you everything I know. The interior of Tom's cottage was dimly lit, filled with the scent of wood and old paper. Shelves lined with faded books and dusty trinkets lined the walls. A fire crackled in the corner, casting long shadows on the floor. Tom motioned for them to sit at a small table, then took a seat himself, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. You see, Tom began, that grave, the one the dog's been guarding, belongs to Sarah Harland. She was a little girl who died over 30 years ago. The officers exchanged surprised looks. A little girl? Jacobs asked. What happened to her? Tom's eyes darkened and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Her death. It wasn't natural. Sarah died young, but her parents were desperate. You see, they had lost another child before her, a son. They were wealthy, well respected, in the town, but their grief, it consumed them. They couldn't stand the thought of losing Sarah, too. Tom paused, his gaze distant, as if he were remembering something long buried, so they sought out someone who promised to bring her back. Thompson leaned in, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Bring her back? You don't mean... Tom cut her off, his voice low and urgent. Yes, they turned to dark rituals, witchcraft. There are stories, old stories, about a woman who lived on the edge of the woods. A healer, some said. Others called her a witch. She could do things that shouldn't be possible. She promised Sarah's parents she could bring their little girl back, but there was a price, a steep one. What price? Jacobs asked, already dreading the answer. The price was Sarah's soul, Tom whispered, and the dog's. They didn't just want Sarah back. They wanted to keep her forever. So they made a pact, a dark, twisted pact. The dog, Sarah's companion, was bound to her, as was the grave. And the child. The child never truly left. Her body was kept, preserved, but not in the way it should have been. She wasn't buried, as the others were. She was kept there, in a state between life and death. Trapped. The room grew colder as Tom's words settled over the officers, the weight of them pressing down like a physical force. But if the grave is so old, why didn't anyone ever notice? Thompson asked. Tom shook his head. The grave was kept quiet, hidden in plain sight. Sarah's parents, they left town after that. People said they couldn't live with what they had done. They disappeared and no one ever spoke of Sarah Harland again. Not until now. The silence that followed was thick, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Jacobs was still trying to process what Tom had just revealed. The pieces of the story seemed to fit together like a puzzle, each detail darker than the last. So the dog, Jacobs started slowly. It's been guarding the grave all this time because it's bound to Sarah? Tom nodded gravely. Yes, the dog is part of the spell, just as much as Sarah's body. It was meant to protect her, to keep her soul from leaving, from ever finding peace. And now the dog. Jacobs trailed off, his thoughts swirling. He looked back toward the cemetery, the distant silhouette of the dog still sitting by the grave. Tom sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. The dog's been waiting all these years for something to happen. I don't know what, but something is coming. Something that was meant to be kept buried. The room fell silent again. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of Tom's words settling in their bones. Jacobs stood up, feeling the chill that had crept into the room. We need to look at the grave, now. Tom's eyes were filled with an emotion that was part dread, part resignation. Be careful, that grave. It's not just earth and stone. It's holding something in. The air grew heavier as Detective Jacobs and Officer Thompson walked toward the cemetery's entrance, the weight of Tom's words still fresh in their minds. The thought of what they might find at Sarah Harland's grave stirred a deep sense of unease in both officers. It wasn't just a child's grave. It wasn't just a dog guarding a long-dead body. Something was wrong. Something unnatural had rooted itself into the very earth of the cemetery, and it felt like it had been there far longer than anyone could understand. As they approached the cemetery gate, the dog was waiting. Its golden coat was streaked with dirt, and its eyes, those eyes, still locked onto the grave. The dog's unwavering vigil hadn't changed, but now there was something almost desperate in its gaze, something in the dog's stillness that hinted at an unspoken plea. It felt as though the animal was aware of their arrival, aware of the tension in the air. Its loyalty was unnerving, like it was bound not just to the grave but to something more sinister. "Let's keep our distance," Jacobs murmured, motioning for Thompson to follow him as they circled around the grave. They both knew it was too dangerous to get too close without knowing more, but the pull of the mystery was undeniable. The grave itself was nestled at the farthest corner of the cemetery, overshadowed by a thick, crooked oak tree whose gnarled roots seemed to crawl toward the ground like something living. The grave's headstone was weathered, barely legible, with the name Sarah Harland etched in worn letters, along with the fading birth and death dates. It looked like a grave that had long been forgotten by time, a place where memories had been buried, where the whispers of a once-cherished life had faded into the earth. Jacobs felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as he observed the grave. Something was off. The earth around it seemed disturbed, as though it had been moved recently. The mound was uneven, as if the soil had been shifted, and there was a deep, almost unnatural depression at the center. "Does it look like this grave's been dug up?" Thompson asked, her voice tight with unease. Jacobs nodded grimly. "It doesn't make sense. There's been no report of anyone digging here recently." They stepped closer, cautious but determined. Jacobs knelt down by the edge of the grave, his hands brushing the dirt. It was soft, too soft, as if the soil hadn't settled in properly, as though something had recently disturbed it. The dog, still watching them from its spot a few feet away, whined, a low, mournful sound that echoed in the otherwise still cemetery. Jacobs hesitated, but the sound of the dog's anguish made him feel the urgency of the moment. This wasn't just about a missing child or a strange dog. There was something deeper here, something far darker that had been buried for too long. "We need to open it," Jacobs said. His voice was firm, but a layer of unease lingered underneath. "If there's something wrong with this grave, we need to know what it is." Thompson looked reluctant, but she nodded. "I don't like it, but I agree." With the police radio crackling in the background, the officers radioed for backup. Soon a few more patrol cars arrived, their lights flickering in the fog that had begun to creep into the cemetery. The air felt thicker now, charged with an energy that none of them could name. The sound of shovels cutting into the earth filled the silence. As the dirt was cleared, an oppressive weight seemed to settle over them. The further down they dug, the heavier the air became. The officers worked quickly but with trepidation. They had no idea what they were uncovering, but each shovel of dirt removed seemed to deepen the mystery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lid of the coffin was visible. It was an old wooden box, the wood gray and cracked with age. But what struck Jacobs first was the absence of decay. He had seen many graves in his time, graves of the elderly, of those who had passed in their sleep, graves of children, but none had remained untouched by time like this one. There was no sign of rot, no signs of insects or decay. This coffin had been preserved, and not in the way one would expect. With the help of two other officers, Jacobs and Thompson managed to pry open the coffin. The creaking sound of the lid felt unnaturally loud in the silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then they saw it. Inside the coffin lay a small body, barely a child's size. But it was not the child they had expected to find. The body was not decayed. In fact, it looked almost preserved. The skin, pale and waxy, had the smooth texture of something that should have long since rotted away. Her hair, once golden, was now matted with dirt, but it was still there, long and unnaturally intact. Her clothes were simple, faded but somehow untouched by the ravages of time. It was as if the body had been encased in some sort of preservation spell, trapped in a state of suspended animation. But that wasn't the most chilling part. Clutched in the small arms of the child's corpse was something that made every officer in the vicinity take a step back in horror. The dog. The same dog they had seen guarding the grave was lying in the arms of the child. But the dog wasn't alive. Its body, too, was perfectly preserved, its eyes wide and unblinking, locked in, an expression of eternal vigilance. Jacob stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. "What the hell?" Thompson, pale and shaken, took a step closer despite herself. She reached out, but Jacobs grabbed her arm to stop her. "Don't touch anything," he hissed, his voice tight with panic. "We don't know what's going on here. It could be dangerous." The officers stood frozen, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The dog, the girl, both were preserved, trapped in a twisted bond that neither time nor death had been able to sever. It was as though they had been frozen in place, locked together by some unnatural force. But why? And what did it mean for the town? Jacobs knew this wasn't just about a mysterious grave or an abandoned dog. This was something far darker. A curse that had been buried along with the bodies of Sarah Harland and her loyal dog. Something had gone terribly wrong, and now the truth was clawing its way back to the surface. As they stood there, unsure of what to do next, the dog let out another low, mournful whine, sending a chill through the officers. It was almost as if it was calling out to them, or warning them. Jacobs turned to Thompson, his face pale with shock. "We need to get this to the lab. We need to find out what's really going on here." But as the dog's mournful cry echoed once more, Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something far worse than they could ever imagine. The unease that hung over the cemetery was palpable, a suffocating presence that none of the officers could escape. The once peaceful resting place of Hollingsworth's departed had become a place of dread. The grave of Sarah Harland and the dog's eerie vigil were no longer a strange curiosity. They were a terrifying reality that had now been exposed. The truth was out, but it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of the preserved bodies, Sarah Harland, no longer a child but an eternal specter trapped in the coffin with her loyal dog, had sent a shockwave through the police force. The first response had been chaos. Officers rushed to document the scene, to seal off the cemetery, to ensure that no one else could get close. But despite their best efforts, an unspoken dread lingered. Detective Jacobs couldn't stop staring at the photographs of the bodies. In the stark light of his office, the image of the girl, pale, almost lifeless, held an unnatural stillness that seemed to pierce through him. It wasn't just that she was preserved, it was that she was tethered to something dark, something that neither time nor death could touch. "This isn't natural," Jacobs muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing with questions he didn't have answers to. Why wasn't she buried properly? Why did they leave her like this? His partner, Officer Thompson, was pacing in the room, her eyes wide, haunted. "I keep thinking back to what Tom said, about the pact, the price for bringing her back. And the dog. They weren't just trying to preserve her life, Jacobs. They were trying to trap her, to keep her soul here in this world." Jacobs swallowed hard, the weight of the words pressing down on him. But why the dog? Why not just the girl? Why did they need it? Thompson paused, her brow furrowing. Maybe the dog wasn't just her companion. Maybe it was part of the ritual. Maybe it was bound to her in some way, like a guardian. But Jacobs wasn't listening. His eyes had shifted toward the photographs of the grave. He was staring at the faint outlines of something else, something he hadn't noticed before. "There's something else here," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something we missed. Look at the coffin. There's an imprint, in the dirt, beneath where the body lay." Thompson leaned in, squinting at the photo. There, in the soil beneath the body, was a strange symbol, faint but unmistakable. It resembled a complex swirling pattern, circular and intricate like a seal. "That looks like a sigil," she murmured. "A symbol used in rituals." Jacobs nodded, his gut tightening. "A binding spell. They weren't just preserving her body, they were keeping something trapped inside her. Or Inside the grave, suddenly the realization hit him like a thunderclap. It wasn't just Sarah's soul they were trying to keep. They were keeping something worse. The air in the room grew colder. The photographs on the desk seemed to grow darker, more foreboding, as though the evil that had been buried in that grave had begun to bleed into the world once again. And it wasn't just the dog. It was the curse. The bond between Sarah and the creature that had been trapped with her in death was a curse, and now it had been awakened. The next morning, the cemetery had taken on a different aura. The sun had barely risen, but an unnatural fog clung to the trees, twisting the once familiar landscape into a bleak and desolate wasteland. The officers who had been assigned to guard the site stood by the entrance, their faces taut with the same tension that had gripped the entire town. But there was something more that had changed: the dog. It wasn't by the grave anymore. The officers hadn't seen it move, but it had vanished. Jacobs and Thompson arrived at the cemetery by mid-morning, and immediately something felt wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if they were walking through a dense fog even though the sky was clear. "It's gone," Thompson said quietly, her voice betraying her nerves. "The dog. It's not here." Jacobs scanned the cemetery, his eyes darting over the familiar rows of graves. But it wasn't the dog he was looking for. It was the feeling. The same creeping sensation that had followed them the day before had returned, only now it was stronger, more palpable. Where would it go? Jacobs muttered under his breath, his gaze shifting to the grave of Sarah Harland. There, in the middle of the field, a figure stood. A dark silhouette, its back to them, unmoving. It was standing right next to the grave. Thompson's hand instinctively went to her holster. "Who's that?" Jacobs reached for her arm to stop her, his heart suddenly racing. "No, wait, it's not a person." Slowly, carefully, they approached the figure, but the closer they got, the more the air around them began to hum with a strange, unnatural energy. It felt electric, like the very atmosphere had charged, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled their chests. When they were close enough to make out the figure, both of them froze in terror. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a living thing at all. Standing by the grave was a shadowy form, shaped like a person but with no features, just an outline, a vague shifting silhouette. Its limbs were long and twisted, its form shifting like smoke in the wind, with a face that seemed to fade in and out of sight. It was as though it was both there and not there at the same time. And then at the foot of the grave, just beside the shadowy figure, lay the dog. But the dog was different. It wasn't the same golden retriever they had seen guarding the grave for days. Its eyes were empty, hollow black voids, its body stiff and lifeless, twisted in a grotesque way that defied nature. The shadow turned slowly, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it was trying to focus on them. "Get back," Jacobs whispered urgently. His voice was barely audible. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the ground beneath them trembled, and the cemetery seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy. The shadow's voice, if it could even be called that, was a dry rasp, like paper tearing. "It's time." Thompson stepped back, her breath shallow. "What is it? What do you want?" The shadow did not answer. Instead, its form began to writhe, the air around them warping as if the fabric of reality itself were bending and twisting. Jacobs could feel something shifting within him, like the world was slipping out of focus. And then the ground erupted. The soil at Sarah Harland's grave cracked open, sending clumps of earth flying into the air. A figure began to rise from the grave. A figure that was not Sarah. A figure that had not been buried there. The air around the grave had grown thick, oppressive. As the earth split open, the ground seemed to exhale an ancient, mournful sigh. The figure that rose from the grave was not Sarah. It was something else, something older, darker. Its form was cloaked in shadow, and as it slowly emerged, the very sky seemed to darken, the sunlight fading into a sickly gray hue. The officers stood frozen in place, unable to look away. The air hummed with energy, the weight of something long buried, pressing down on them. The creature, if it could even be called that, shifted as though it were made of smoke, its outline rippling and warping with every movement. It was humanoid, but its body seemed to ripple and stretch, as though it were never meant to be seen, never meant to exist in the world of the living. The shadowy figure's eyes, black as the void, locked onto Jacobs and Thompson, and for a moment, neither could breathe. A chill, colder than anything they had ever felt, spread through their bodies. "It has awakened," the shadow rasped, its voice like 1,000 whispers colliding. It didn't speak with words. It spoke with feelings, with intentions that pressed against the officers' minds like cold fingers wrapped around their hearts. "You have disturbed the bargain." Jacob's mind raced. The bargain, the ritual. Tom had mentioned it, and now, standing before this thing, he understood. The pact made between Sarah's parents and whatever dark force they had summoned was never meant to be broken. It had bound Sarah's soul to the grave, trapped in a state of eternal stasis. And the dog. It had been a vessel, a guardian, a part of the ritual that kept the boundary between life and death intact. But they had broken it. They had opened the grave, exposing the curse to the light. "You shouldn't have come," the owl shadow said, its form twisting unnaturally. The dog was never meant to be freed. It was the last barrier. Now the souls are free. And you. It looked directly at Jacobs and Thompson. "You will join them." The officers stepped back in fear, but something in the air stopped them, something invisible, a force pressing against their chests, preventing them from moving. It was as though they were caught in the grip of an invisible hand. The dog, now lifeless in the shadow's presence, twitched. Its form began to shift, its body melting and reforming as if it were being remade by the very thing standing before them. A low growl rumbled from its throat, and its hollow eyes snapped open. But this wasn't the dog they had known. The creature, now standing before them, was far more sinister, a twisted, unnatural version of the loyal animal it had once been. The officers could feel the temperature drop further, could feel the very essence of life fading from the air, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The dog, this thing, was not of this world. "Get back!" Jacob shouted, his hand shaking as he reached for his gun. But as he drew it, the air around him vibrated, the ground shuddering beneath his feet. The shadow leaned forward, its form solidifying as it stepped closer, its eyes locking onto Jacob's with an unsettling calm. "No need for weapons," it whispered, its voice a jarring mixture of malice and sorrow. "You cannot kill what is already dead." Before Jacobs could respond, the dog lunged forward, its jaws snapping with unnatural speed. But just as quickly as it moved, it stopped, frozen in midair, suspended by some unseen force. A dark, glowing energy swirled around it, and it let out a horrible guttural sound like a cry for help. The shadow raised a hand, and the dog fell to the ground, lifeless once more. Its body, however, didn't remain still. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to decay. As though every second it was touched by the curse, it withered away in an accelerated state of decomposition. The smell was unbearable, flesh rotting in seconds, the very essence of life fading. Jacobs could barely keep himself upright as the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. "What is this? What are you?" The shadow's form stretched, its outline flickering as it spoke, the words tearing at the very fabric of reality itself. "I am the price, the soul bound by the ritual, the last tether to the darkness." The creature's form grew more solid, more horrifying, as it took on a new shape. No longer just a shadow, it was becoming something more, a monstrous, twisted being, half human, half creature, its eyes filled with infinite rage. Its body writhed like a living nightmare, a combination of flesh and shadow, of death and despair. "The price of immortality is never paid in full," the shadow growled, its voice now a deep guttural rumble. "Sarah's soul was never meant to stay. It was never meant to live forever. And the dog was never meant to guard her. It was only a tool, an anchor. But now it has been broken. Now you have awakened us, Jacob's mind reeled with the horror of it all. This wasn't just about a child's grave or a mysterious dog. The entity standing before them was something ancient, an evil that had been bound to this world by a dark pact. And now, it was free. The shadow lunged forward, its form shifting into a whirlwind of darkness. Time seemed to slow as it reached, for Jacobs and Thompson, its tendrils stretching toward them like claws of doom. Jacobs felt the cold touch of its presence on his skin, like an icy blade scraping his soul. But in that moment of pure terror, something inside Jacobs snapped. With the last of his strength, he grabbed a handful of dirt from the grave, holding it tightly in his palm. The same symbol, the same sigil he had seen in the photos, was still visible in the earth around them. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was doing, but one thought pierced through the panic. The ritual, the binding. Without thinking, he threw the dirt toward the creature, speaking words he didn't understand but felt compelled to say. "By the pact, I bind you." A violent explosion of energy rippled through the air. The ground cracked open, again, and the shadow screamed, a deafening, otherworldly cry of fury and pain. Then silence. When the dust settled and the energy faded, the cemetery was still. The fog had lifted and the sun had returned, casting light on the once dreaded grave. The dog's body lay motionless in the dirt, now fully decayed, its form completely vanished. Jacobs and Thompson stood there, their bodies shaking, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The curse was gone. But in the back of Jacob's mind, one question still lingered. What had they truly awakened? We are reaching the exciting final moments of this incredible auction, and I can see the energy in the room. It's electric. This is your chance to secure the item you've been eyeing, the one that's been on your mind all night. The clock is ticking down, and this is it. We are in the final stretch. Look at that item. Whether it's a rare collectible, a once-in-a-lifetime experience, or that stunning masterpiece you've been waiting for, it could be yours right now, but not for long. Not if someone else places that final bid. Remember, folks, every bid counts. You've all been so generous tonight, and the proceeds are going to support a cause that is so close to our hearts. Your bids matter, and they make a difference, so I ask you right now, who's ready to take it home? Do I hear $500, $600? Don't let this opportunity slip through your fingers. The bidding ends in just seconds, so don't wait. Raise your paddles, make your move, and let's finish strong. Here we go, folks. 3, 2, 1. Sold. Thank you all for your incredible generosity and participation tonight. Let's hear a round of applause for everyone's amazing contributions.